One of the most compelling pieces of testimony regarding the events of Caesar and Lois's seizure by the slave owners came from Patience Graves, the wife of Taylor Elijah Graves. And in her deposition she wrote, "I am Patience Graves of lawful age, and my deposition is as follows. I was present at the time that Caesar and his family was taken by Prior to carry off, and that Nathaniel Mann was then present and held a drawn sword in his hand. And as I attempted to go into the house from which the Negroes were taken, he shook the sword over my head, and he charged me with great anger in his countenance not to go in upon my peril." Today we're outside of the Reverend Samuel Peters' house in Hebron, Connecticut, where a very important event took place after the Revolutionary War. Caesar Peters was purchased by one of Hebron's most famous residents, Mary Peters, at the age of 8 in Boston, and she moved him back to Hebron. Mary, out of anger, sold Caesar to her son, Reverend Samuel Peters, because he decided to marry Lois, and that was without her permission. Caesar and Lois worked for Reverend Sam for years. Everybody was happy until Reverend Samuel decided to become a Tory, and he stood up for the Tories. And during the American Revolution, that was not a popular position to be in. He was run out of town, and he left Caesar and Lois here to care for his property. One day, Reverend Samuel, who had fled to England, ran out of money, and basically he contacted his attorneys in Hebron and said, "Sell my assets." And at that time the assets included Caesar and Lois. So one day David Pryor came up from South Carolina to collect Caesar and the family. He hired a gang of men down in Norwich, and they brought up a wagon. Hebron men were gone that day. They were out doing militia training. The wives were around, and one man, Taylor Graves, was around. And so there was no one really to help Caesar and Lois. The women did try. Taylor Graves did try, but they were still thrown into a wagon. They were taken to Norwich, and in the interim, the women went and got their men at militia training. They brought them back. They said, "You must save Caesar and his family." They concocted a ruse to bring the family back. Taylor Graves swore that Caesar left town with the slave traders without paying for the clothes on his back. 6 Hebron men and a constable rode all night, and they finally got to Norwich just as Caesar and the family were being loaded on the boat. It is written that Caesar's salt tears were frozen on his cheek when he saw his neighbors coming to his rescue. This story is significant because it shows that in a time of need, a community rallied together. They took a step that had never been taken before, and that is to actually rescue a black family. It's so easy in any age to sit by and not take action, but in this case, the circumstances, the relationship with the family led the neighbors to say, "We must do something about this, and we must do something quickly. There's no time to sit and debate. We must come up with a plan, and we must implement the plan, because the family will be gone in a short period of time." If other communities had this opportunity, would they take it? And that's the important question. One of the things that was valued among all citizens of Hebron was their industriousness. And if you look at depositions that the neighbors gave in support of Caesar and Lois, they kept stressing things like their industriousness, their frugality, their hard work ethic, their morals, their character, and interestingly enough, also the fact that Caesar was a sober individual. Those are characteristics that were highly expected of any citizen of Hebron. There's no doubt in my mind but that Caesar and Lois considered themselves equal residents, equal citizens in the community of Hebron. Outside of the color of Caesar and Lois's skin, they behaved no differently. They contributed no less than any other resident of the community. Every time I come out to this property, I have a feeling and a sense of Caesar and Lois still being here. You have to remember that this home was owned by Reverend Samuel Peters, and Caesar and Lois probably lived in the very back of the house, and if not at the back of the house, some other adjoining house on this property. And as I look in that direction, where Caesar and Lois were seized by the slaveholders, I can feel the wagon. I can feel the cries and the shouts of the children as their parents were placed in irons and they were taken away. Sometimes just being in a location helps you understand history. One of the reasons that this story is so important is because of the way it influenced future generations. And by that I mean people in Hebron and people across the country. It's interesting that Caesar himself died in 1814, which was the exact same year that Josephine Sophia White was born here in Hebron. Josephine Sophia White married a man named Mr. Griffin, and she moved to Ohio, where she founded the Ohio Freedmen's Bureau. She was a leader in the abolitionist movement and ultimately served as a consultant to Abraham Lincoln. She advised Lincoln on how slaves could be incorporated into society once he issued his Emancipation Proclamation. There's no doubt but that Josephine Sophia White Griffin, who is buried here in Hebron today, was influenced by the story of Caesar and Lois. When I first moved to the town of Hebron, I heard about the legend of Caesar and Lois, and our local town clerk informed me that she had the original documents still on file, which I found fascinating. So I went down to the town hall, I looked at the documents, I started doing more work on the story. The more I studied, the more I learned. As you read the original documents, you feel the passion of the neighbors. Patience Graves tried to stop the wagon, and Nathaniel Mann, the attorney, actually pulled a sword and drew it over her head and threatened her peril, and she wrote about this. She was so emotional. When you read these primary documents about an event, you can't help but get excited and want to know more. And the reason, too, is that the more you learn, the more you can preserve, the more you can keep for future generations so that they also have this valuable lesson readily available for them. It's important for you as a student to go out and study your own local history, because every community has a history and there are valuable lessons to be learned. Those lessons could be good lessons and they could be bad lessons, but at least there are lessons that can be carried forward for future generations. It should become your job to find some story or some legend that you can research and tell your children and tell other people in the community so that that story is never lost.